I heard them argue about who would take me in when I couldn't walk. I was still in the room. My body had long since begun its slow rebellion against the passage of time, my knees stiffening and my hands shaking when I picked up a glass. But it was their words, their voices, sharp and clipped, that really hurt. They thought I couldn't hear. Maybe they thought I wouldn't. But I did. And I wish I hadn't. My son, Adam, was the first to speak, his voice tight and controlled, as if he were discussing business rather than family. I can't take care of her, Lisa. Not when she can't even walk without help. What if it gets worse? He said. I froze in place. I couldn't look at him, not now, not after he said that. The man I had raised, the boy I held when he was sick, the one I cooked for, bandaged wounds for, the one I drove to soccer practice and stayed up late with when he was struggling with his first heartbreak, was now deciding whether or not he could take care of his own mother. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, spoke next, her voice faint but firm. I know, Adam. It's too much. We have the kids, and we're already stretched thin. Maybe it's time for her to think about a care facility. She said it like it was a suggestion. The words floated in the air like balloons tied to the ceiling, impossible to reach, unable to be caught. It wasn't that she didn't care. I knew she did, in her own way. But it was clear now that she thought I was too much, an inconvenience she hadn't signed up for. A burden, not a mother. She can stay with my mom for now, Lisa added, as if I were nothing more than a misplaced item in a guest room, a pile of clothes to be folded and put away until someone decided where I fit best. I heard Adam sigh, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to come from the depths of his chest. I just don't know, Lisa. She won't like it. And she's not getting any better. It wasn't that they didn't have their reasons. I could hear the fatigue in their voices, the exhaustion that came from managing their busy lives, the stress of raising kids, keeping up appearances. I could see it in the way they handled me, as though I were a relic from another time, one that no longer had a place in their world. They couldn't keep up with me anymore, and I couldn't keep up with them. But the way they spoke, the way they dismissed me so casually, like I was some distant relative, was the part that stung. It wasn't the idea that they couldn't help. It was the underlying message that I was no longer someone they needed to help. I was a leftover, a thing to be managed rather than loved. As I sat there in that room, pretending to look at my knitting, pretending to be oblivious, I couldn't help but wonder when things had changed. When had I stopped being the center of their world? When had I become an inconvenience? The room I sat in had once been mine, the space where I had spent countless hours caring for my children, sewing their clothes, patching up scraped knees, listening to their laughter and their cries. Now, it felt like I was just an extra piece of furniture in someone else's home, a relic they no longer knew what to do with. I remember when Adam was younger, and he used to ask me how I did it, how I kept everything together, how I managed to run the house, take care of the family, and still keep a smile on my face. I used to tell him that it was simple, just love, patience, and a willingness to do what needed to be done. But now, as I listened to him argue with Lisa about where I would go when I couldn't walk, I wondered if that love had ever truly been enough. Or if I had given so much of myself that in the end there was nothing left of me but a woman with a shrinking world, struggling to hold on. They didn't know I was listening. They didn't know I was sitting there, my hands trembling slightly as I held the knitting needles, my mind racing through 1,000 memories. They probably thought I was too old to understand what was being said, or that I wouldn't care. But I did. I cared. And I felt the weight of their words like a boulder pressing against my chest. They didn't care about how I felt anymore. They just cared about how to make their lives easier. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I had raised my children to be independent, to think for themselves, to build lives of their own. I had given them everything I had, my time, my love, my energy, and now they were telling me it was time to leave, to let go. The same children I had nurtured, guided, and cared for were now talking about me as though I were something to be discarded. And then, in the silence that followed, I made a decision. A small, quiet decision that no one would ever see coming. I would pack my things. I would leave. I didn't know where I would go or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. Not like this. Not as someone who was invisible, who was only tolerated because of blood, because of obligation. So I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the room I had once called my own. I opened the closet door and pulled out the suitcase I had kept tucked away for years, a relic from when I used to travel before my knees gave out. It was a small, worn bag, nothing fancy, but sturdy enough. I hadn't used it in years, but tonight it felt like the only thing in the world that was mine. As I packed it with a few changes of clothes, a scarf my late husband had bought me, and a few personal items, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that I could start over, that I could still make choices for myself, even if they didn't understand, even if I had to leave everything behind. The next morning, I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I left quietly, taking nothing more than what I could carry. As I stepped out the door, I felt the weight of the house lift off my shoulders. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was doing something for me. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but it was a step towards something different, something that had always been waiting for me. And as I walked down the street, suitcase in hand, I couldn't help but wonder what they would think when they realized I was gone. Would they come looking for me? Would they care? Or would they just continue with their lives the same way they always had, pretending that I had never been a part of it? I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I was free. I spent the night in the small, cold motel room, the only sound being the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The city lights filtered weakly through the thin curtains, casting a muted glow across the cracked walls. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't known in years: peace. I wasn't waiting anymore, and for the first time, I was awake to the world around me, not just waiting for someone to need me, or worse, waiting for someone to notice I was no longer there. In the morning, I stepped outside, the sharp chill of the air biting at my skin, as though the day itself had come to offer me a fresh start. The sun was still hidden behind the clouds, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, I was my own person, standing on my own 2 feet, and I felt it, finally free from the weight of my son's silent dismissal, free from the endless subtext of my daughter-in-law's polite but pointed indifference. I didn't have much in my pocket, just enough to get by for a while. And yet, as I stood there, looking at the small, worn-down streets of Portland, I realized I wasn't as lost as I had felt just days before. There was something liberating about the city, something that pulled at the edges of my soul, as though it was telling me that I didn't have to be anyone's shadow anymore. I wasn't old, not in the way they made me feel. I was still breathing, still moving, still capable of making my own decisions. In my mind, I heard my son's voice again, the one that had said so plainly, "What if it gets worse?" And suddenly, I realized the truth. I wasn't going to get worse. I was just going to get older, but there was still time, wasn't there? Time to live in a way that wasn't defined by others' expectations. After breakfast at a small, dusty cafe, I decided to take a walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I felt the need to stretch my legs, to find something in this city that would give me a sense of direction. I passed by the old bookstore on 3rd Avenue, a place I used to visit with Derek before the cancer, before the house, before the children, before everything started to slip away. The memory hit me unexpectedly, like a sudden gust of wind. We'd spent hours there, flipping through books, talking about everything and nothing. He had always been the talkative one, the dreamer, while I had been more practical. But we'd balanced each other, or at least that's how I had seen it. He'd always been my rock, my anchor, and without him, it was as though I had lost the thread of my own life. But here, in Portland, as I stood in front of that same bookstore, I realized that the thread wasn't lost. It was still there, waiting for me to pick it up again. The bookstore was small, cramped even, but it smelled of old paper and dust, comforting smells, familiar in a way that made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. I walked inside, the bell above the door chiming as I entered. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his book, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. He nodded at me as I passed by, offering a quiet hello that felt like an invitation rather than a greeting. I wasn't here to buy anything. I just wanted to breathe in the air, to remember a time when I had the luxury of getting lost in a book for hours, a time when I didn't have to worry about the judgments of others or the weight of responsibility. Pressing down on my shoulders, I lingered for a few moments, taking in the rows of books, the dust-covered shelves, the worn-out chairs that seemed to invite people to sit and read. It was simple, quiet, but it felt like home in a way the perfect house I'd been tossed out of never had. But I couldn't stay forever. So I left, stepping back out into the chilly morning air, feeling the weight of the city's quiet hum under my feet. I walked for hours, wandering through streets I didn't know, past storefronts and coffee shops, down alleyways and side streets that seemed to twist and turn without any clear direction. And yet, in that moment, I realized I didn't need to know where I was going. I was just moving, taking one step after another, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting. I wasn't waiting for Adam to call, or Lisa to ask me how I was doing, or anyone to tell me where I should go next. I was simply walking. By late afternoon, I found myself sitting in a small park near the edge of the city, the soft rustling of the trees above me and the distant sound of children playing nearby. I didn't know why I was here, or what had brought me to this particular spot, but I felt a quiet peace wash over me. It wasn't something loud or dramatic, just a gentle, persistent sense that I was finally taking control of my own life again. I opened my bag and pulled out the letter I had written to myself that morning. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, or why. I hadn't even told Adam or Lisa. It was as though I had erased myself from their lives completely, and for the first time, I realized that was exactly what I needed. I needed to erase myself from their expectations, their demands, their constant need to mold me into someone I was never meant to be. I unfolded the letter slowly, reading it again. It wasn't long, just a few simple words. But it was the first time I had truly admitted to myself that I was done being someone's obligation. It was the first time I realized that my life was still mine, even if no one else seemed to think so. "You don't need them anymore," it said. "You've got this. You can be someone else now. You can finally be yourself." The letter felt like a small but significant victory, one I had fought for in silence. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I didn't need to answer to anyone's expectations. I wasn't broken, not in the way they thought. I was simply in the process of rediscovering who I was, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into my bag, and as I sat there in the park, I felt a shift inside me, a subtle but undeniable change. I had stepped away from my old life. I had walked away from the hurt, the betrayal, and the rejection. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. I didn't need Adam or Lisa to tell me what I could or couldn't do. I didn't need anyone to tell me what I was capable of. I was capable of deciding my own future, of building my own life. And that was a power I had never truly realized I still had. When I finally stood up and began walking back toward the edge of the park, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, unassuming cafe tucked away behind some trees. The sign above the door was simple, written in cursive: The Old Oak Cafe. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go inside. It felt like the kind of place where no one would ask questions, where no one would expect anything from me. It was just a small, quiet place, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't seeking approval or permission. I was just living, breathing, and existing in my own way. The door creaked softly as I entered, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was a simple, cozy place, dimly lit, with old wooden tables and mismatched chairs. There were a few people sitting at tables, but the atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful. I walked to the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching the world outside go by. I didn't know what my next step would be, but I didn't need to. For once, I wasn't rushing toward an end. I was just here, in this moment, and that was enough. It was only later, when I received a phone call from Kieran, that I realized the enormity of what I had done. His voice crackled with concern, a note of fear in it that I hadn't expected. "Grandma, where are you? We've been looking for you." "Dad and Mom, they're going crazy. Are you okay?" I could hear the worry in his voice, but there was something else too. Something I hadn't heard from anyone else in a long time. It wasn't guilt or concern wrapped in judgment. It was simple, pure love. I hadn't been forgotten. I hadn't been lost. And for the first time, I realized that my place wasn't tied to the life I'd left behind. It was here, with me, in whatever I chose to create. So, I told Kieran I was fine, and that I was okay. It wasn't a lie, not really. I was more than okay. I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The days blurred together after that. The quiet of my new life in Portland settled around me like the cool, wet air that seemed to cling to everything. There was something to be said for silence, for not having to fill every space with conversation or expectation, for not needing to explain myself or justify the choices I made. It was a strange peace, one I hadn't known in years, and it was hard to tell if it was the city or the distance from my old life that gave me this sense of freedom. I worked at the cafe every morning, finding a rhythm in the clink of coffee cups, the hiss of the steam wand, the murmur of customers. By afternoon, I would walk, letting my feet take me wherever they pleased. The pain in my knees had lessened, and though I was far from young, I had stopped thinking of myself as fragile, as someone who had to be handled with care. It wasn't a grand existence, but it was mine, and that was enough. But then, a letter came. I hadn't expected anything to reach me, not after I'd shut off my phone and stopped checking emails. The world outside my new life seemed so far away, and for a while I was content to let it stay that way. I had learned, over the years, that distance could heal. It could make everything feel quieter, more manageable. But this letter, this envelope with my son's handwriting, shook something loose inside me. It arrived on a grey morning when the fog still clung to the edges of the streets, when the world felt still and muted. I held it in my hands for longer than I should have, studying the loops of his cursive as if it could tell me something I hadn't already known. He hadn't written to me in months. His silence had become a familiar thing, something I had grown accustomed to in the years leading up to the day I left. But now, holding his letter, I felt the weight of it again, like an anchor I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I opened it slowly, each fold of the paper another reminder of how things had changed. "Mom," it began, and just that one word, so simple, so familiar, sent a ripple of warmth through me. "I don't know what you're doing or where you've gone, but you need to come home. You've made your point. We're sorry. Please, we need to talk." It wasn't the apology I had hoped for. Not really. It wasn't an admission of what had happened, of the way they had left me behind, of the hurt that had grown between us like a wall neither of us knew how to climb. It was the same thing he had always said to me when things got tough. "We need to talk." A simple, clean phrase that erased everything else. It wasn't a conversation. It was an order, and I felt it in my bones. "We need to talk." I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them, trying to figure out if there was any hint of remorse beneath the surface. But all I could hear was the same old voice, the one that had always assumed I would be there, the one that never questioned if I wanted to be. He wasn't sorry for what had happened. He was sorry because I was still gone, and in that moment, I realized something that took the air from my lungs. He didn't need me. He just needed control. He wanted me back in my old place, my old role, where I was nothing more than an extension of his life, a background player in a story I no longer recognized. I didn't respond to the letter right away. Instead, I sat with it for a long time, the words spinning in my mind like a record that had been playing too long. I wasn't angry, not at first. I had gotten used to the silence, used to the emptiness between us. But now, reading his words, I felt the edges of something sharp begin to form in my chest, something I hadn't realized had been waiting for years to break free. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I had never been a part of his life in the way he thought. I had been useful, yes, in the way a tool is useful to a mechanic, but never more than that. He had never really seen me, not in the way that mattered, not as a person with my own needs, my own wants. He had always seen me as an extension of his life, something to be leaned on when it was convenient, something to be pushed away when it wasn't. I didn't call him. I didn't send a letter. Instead, I let the days stretch on, each one bringing me further away from the life I had once known, from the person I had once been. And in the quiet of those days, I began to see how deeply I had been erased, how much of myself I had allowed them to take from me. There had been a time when I would have answered the call, when I would have gone back, swallowed my pride, and returned to the place where I had been needed, even if only for a moment. But now, I couldn't. I had seen too much. I had learned too much. And I wasn't going to let myself slip back into the shadows again. But Adam wasn't done. The letter was only the beginning. The real escalation came a few days later when I received a phone call. I had been expecting it, in a way. I had been expecting that at some point he would try to drag me back into the fold, try to make me believe that I had a place there. I didn't answer the phone, not at first. The number was unfamiliar, and I wasn't ready to hear what Adam had to say, not yet. But the voicemail that followed, the tight, clipped tone of his voice, made something inside me snap. "Mum, We need to talk. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We're worried about you. You need to come home. Please. Don't make this harder for everyone. The words stung in a way that I hadn't expected. I thought I had heard it all before. Thought I had built up enough walls around myself to keep the hurt out. But this was different. It wasn't just the guilt, the pressure to return. It was the insinuation that I was somehow the one making things difficult, the one who was wrong for choosing to leave, for choosing to exist without their permission. He had no idea what it had cost me to leave, to make that first, terrifying step away from everything I had known. But here he was, making it sound as though I had betrayed him, as if I were the one causing the rift, as if my choice to live my own life had somehow been a betrayal. I could feel the old, familiar ache in my chest, the one I had carried for years but never acknowledged, and it twisted inside me like a knife. They thought I was being unreasonable, but they had no idea what unreasonable truly looked like. They had no idea how much I had given, how much I had sacrificed, only to be discarded when I wasn't needed anymore. And yet, here I was, fighting for my own life, for my own dignity, and still, they couldn't see it. They couldn't understand that the price of their love wasn't worth the cost of my soul. I didn't call back. Instead, I went to the bank the next morning. I withdrew the money I had saved, the money they didn't know about, the money that had always been mine, and only mine. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask for permission. I was finally doing something for me, for the first time in years. The money wasn't for anything grand, just a buffer, something to keep me steady in this new life I had built. But as I walked out of the bank, I felt the weight of Adam's voice behind me, still pulling at me, still trying to reel me back into his world. It was a tug I had been trying to ignore for so long, but now it was harder to avoid. Later that week, I found myself standing outside the cafe, feeling the first bite of cold autumn air on my cheeks, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. I had begun to worry about what would happen if I didn't respond, if I didn't go back. What would they do if I stayed here, kept myself separate, kept myself in this little corner of the world where I was finally starting to breathe again? Would they forget me? Would they stop calling? Would they stop caring? And for the first time in a long time, I realized something that was both terrifying and liberating. I didn't care anymore. They had made their choice when they left me behind, and now it was my turn to make mine. I was no longer just a mother, a grandmother, a caretaker. I was something else now. And the truth was, I wasn't ready to give that up yet. It was on a Thursday morning, the kind that starts with the air still heavy from overnight rain and the streets smelling like damp leaves, that I stood in front of the mirror in Joyce's house and didn't look away. I had avoided mirrors for years. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because what I saw never felt like mine. A woman with grey roots too stubborn for dye, with hands that had stopped looking delicate decades ago, with a face lined not by age, but by resignation. But that morning, I looked, and I stayed looking. I was wearing the navy coat I'd bought after my first paycheck, the one with deep pockets that made me feel like I could carry something valuable again. Underneath, just a simple blouse. But I had ironed it the night before, and somehow that small act, the heat, the pressure, the smoothing out of the fabric, had settled something inside me too. I adjusted the collar, ran my fingers along the hem, and thought, I am still here. Not as I was, not as they once needed me to be, but as I am. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The cafe was quiet when I arrived. Heather handed me a fresh apron, a soft olive green one that didn't scratch like the others. "You're early," she said, though we both knew I always was. I'd started showing up before the rest because I liked the silence before the city fully woke, the way the light filtered through the windows, the way the chairs sat tucked under the tables like obedient children. It was a peace I hadn't known when I was younger, when every morning was chaos, lunches to pack, clothes to find, tears to dry. Now this quiet hour belonged to me. I made coffee without rushing. I wiped the counter with slow, purposeful movements, and as the regulars trickled in, contractors, nurses, a man with a weathered coat and paint-stained hands who always left exact change, I found that I was learning names again, routines, preferences. I remembered who took 2 sugars, who liked their muffin warmed. I remembered because I wanted to, not because I had to, and that difference was everything. By noon, I would walk. The city had become my map, each block a line drawn across a version of myself I was still discovering. I didn't walk with purpose, not at first, but over time, I found myself gravitating toward familiar places, bookstores, bakeries, even a quiet garden behind the library that no one seemed to know about. I'd sit on a bench there, my coat buttoned to the chin, and watch the wind stir the petals from trees whose names I didn't know. Sometimes I'd bring a crossword puzzle from the cafe, the ones Heather started setting aside for me, saying only, "You look like the type who finishes what she starts." I never told her how much that meant. One afternoon, I wandered into a small second-hand shop just off the main street. The windows were dusty, and the bell above the door was half unhinged, but inside the air smelled like cedar and old wool. I wasn't looking for anything. I never was, but then I saw it. A wooden frame, hand-carved, still solid despite its age. It reminded me of the one Derek had made me for our first anniversary, the one that used to hold our wedding photo, back before it yellowed and curled in the sun. I picked it up, turned it in my hands, and felt something warm unfurl in my chest. I bought it for $2 and carried it home like it was something precious. That night, I took out a photo I hadn't looked at in years, me holding Kieran in the backyard, both of us laughing, my hair pulled back with a scarf, his face still round with baby fat. I placed it in the frame, set it on the windowsill, and whispered, "You're still mine." Living with Joyce had become a rhythm, too. She was no one's definition of sweet, but there was honesty in the way she moved through the world, and I admired that. We rarely spoke in the mornings. She drank her tea without sugar. I made coffee with too much. We passed each other like ships in a shared harbour, each keeping to her own course. But in the evenings, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the cat sprawled between us, and shared quiet commentary on neighbours, weather, or whatever nonsense had been on the news. One evening, without looking up from her knitting, she said, "You're getting steadier." I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded. Because I could feel it too. The shaking in my hands had lessened, not the physical kind, but the kind that came from always bracing for the next disappointment. I hadn't turned my phone back on, not because I was hiding, not anymore, but because I liked the quiet, the absence of expectation, no buzzing with guilt, no alerts that meant nothing but carried everything. But I kept the phone in a drawer, wrapped in an old scarf. It wasn't gone, just dormant, waiting for the moment when I might choose to reach, not react. That was the difference now. Everything I did came from choice, not duty. One morning, Arthur, one of the cafe regulars, always in his grey windbreaker, stopped me mid-shift. He'd been coming in for weeks, quiet, polite, never in a rush. That day, he looked up from his coffee and asked, You ever been to the rose gardens? I shook my head. You should go, he said. They're best when they're almost past bloom. That's when they smell the most honest. I didn't know what he meant. Not really, but it stayed with me all day. That evening, I looked it up and wrote the address on a piece of paper. I didn't go right away, but I kept the paper in my coat pocket. A promise, maybe, to see something beautiful just because I could. And then, one night, I had a dream. I was standing in a hallway, not one I recognized, but I knew it belonged to a house I'd lived in long ago. There were doors on either side, all closed. At the end of the hall was a mirror. I walked toward it slowly, and when I looked in, the reflection was not mine. It was my mother's, not how she looked at the end, but how she had looked when I was a child. Strong, wide-hipped, her hair pinned back, her hands always busy. She looked at me and said nothing, just nodded once. When I woke up, my cheeks were wet. Not from sadness, from something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. The next day, I went to the rose gardens. I took the bus, dressed in my coat, scarf tucked tight. The air was crisp, and the sky hung low with clouds that didn't threaten rain but hinted at it. The gardens were nearly empty. Most of the blooms were past their peak, petals soft and wilting at the edges. But Arthur had been right. The smell was thick, heady, almost too much, like the memory of something you thought you'd forgotten. I walked slowly, stopping to read the names of each variety: Queen Elizabeth, Mr. Lincoln, Peace. I found a bench near the far edge of the garden, sat down, and let the stillness wash over me. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who packed lunches, who stayed up folding laundry, who drove to every dentist appointment, every recital, every school meeting. I had done it without asking for thanks. I had done it because I thought that was what love meant, giving until there was nothing left. But sitting there, surrounded by dying roses that still held their scent, I realized I had been wrong. Love wasn't about disappearance. It wasn't about fading into usefulness. It was about presence. It was about seeing and being seen. And I wanted to be seen again. When I returned home that evening, I took the phone from the drawer, unwrapped it, and turned it on. Not because I owed anyone anything, but because I was ready to choose what stayed and what went, and to say, in my own quiet way, that I had not disappeared. I had simply chosen myself, at last. The phone rang the day after I turned it back on, a harsh noise that seemed too loud after the quiet I'd come to cherish. I stared at the screen for a moment before I answered, feeling the weight of years and unspoken words settle in the pit of my stomach. I hadn't expected to hear from them, not after all this time, not after the letters and the silence that followed. I had moved on in a way, or at least I thought I had. I thought that by leaving, by stepping away, I could escape the pressure, the weight of everything they had made me feel. But there I was, holding the phone, knowing full well that the conversation was coming whether I was ready or not. "Mum, where are you?" Adam's voice came through the line, tight and strained, like he was trying to hold something back. The words seemed to hang there, heavy with accusation, with hurt, with guilt that I could feel, even though he didn't say it outright. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of his breathing on the other end, waiting for him to say more. For a moment, it felt like we were both suspended in time, like nothing had changed, like I was still the woman who had always answered his calls, who had always put everything aside for him, for them. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't even sure who I was in this moment. Mom? He asked again, his voice rising slightly, the tension thickening between us. I'm fine, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I had expected. A calmness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know where the words came from, but they felt true. I was fine. I was more than fine. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to exist. I'm in Portland, I added, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It wasn't something I had planned to say, but in that moment, it felt important. It felt like the first step in standing my ground, in no longer hiding behind the polite veneer I had worn for so long. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him shift, the noise of movement, maybe him running a hand through his hair, maybe him pacing. I didn't know. I didn't need to know. Portland? Mom, why didn't you— His voice cracked, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but then the anger surged. The same anger that had been simmering under the surface for years. The kind of anger that had built up from decades of giving, of sacrificing, of being ignored and dismissed in favor of whatever they wanted. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. You weren't here, Adam, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I wasn't shouting, but I could feel the force of my words behind each syllable. I was waiting for you, and you never came. I waited 8 hours in that damn lounge while you went on your vacation without a second thought. My words came out sharper than I had intended, and I could hear him flinch on the other end of the line. It was the truth, plain and simple. They hadn't even noticed when I wasn't there. They hadn't even bothered to look. And now, months later, here he was, calling as if it was all just a misunderstanding, as if everything could go back to the way it was before. But it couldn't. Not anymore. Not after the silence. Not after the betrayal. Mum, I didn't— He started to say something, but I cut him off. Not because I wanted to shut him down, but because I couldn't let him rewrite what had happened. No, Adam. Don't. Don't tell me you didn't mean it. Don't tell me you didn't know. I know you. You knew exactly what you were doing. You and Lisa both knew. I wasn't even a thought to you. I was a problem to be solved, a thing to be managed. And when I didn't fit into your perfect little picture of how your life should be, you left me behind. I could feel the weight of those words as I said them, like stones being thrown into the water, the ripples stretching out farther than I had expected. There was another silence, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when something too long buried has been dug up, when the truth has been spoken, and there's nothing left to say. Adam didn't respond right away, and when he did, his voice had lost the edge of urgency it had carried earlier. It was flat, resigned, and somehow that hurt more than anything else he could have said. So, what now, Mom? You're just done with us? I had expected the question, but still it caught me off guard. It stung in a way I hadn't anticipated, because deep down I had hoped there would be some understanding, some acknowledgement that what had happened mattered, that I mattered. But there was nothing. There was no apology, no regret, just him, trying to piece together the family he thought he still had. And in that moment, I realized what was missing, what had always been missing. They never saw me. Not really. They saw what they wanted from me. They saw what they needed me to be, but they never saw me. I'm not done, Adam, I said, the words surprising me as they left my mouth. I'm not done with you, but I'm done being treated like I don't matter. I'm done being the backup plan. I'm done waiting for you to notice me. If you want to fix this, you'll have to start by seeing me. Really seeing me. Not as your mother, not as your obligation, but as someone who deserves more than scraps of attention. I could hear him inhale sharply, and for a moment I thought he might finally get it. I thought he might say the words I'd been waiting for, the words that would finally make me feel like I wasn't alone in this. But instead, he said something that made the pit in my stomach turn cold. I'm sending someone to Portland to talk to you. We need to fix this, Mom. It's time you came home. And just like that, the air in the room shifted. I felt the familiar tug of their control, the subtle manipulation, like strings being pulled from across the miles, trying to reel me back into their world. I had been expecting it, but it still took me by surprise, the coldness of it. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a plea. It was a demand. And suddenly, I realized that I hadn't just left home. I had left them. No, I said, my voice more forceful this time, stronger than I had ever imagined it could be. No, Adam, you don't get to do that. I'm not going anywhere. Not for you, not for anyone. I could feel him hesitate on the other end, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might understand. But then, his voice dropped to that tone he used when he was trying to convince me of something, trying to make me see it his way. Mum, you're being unreasonable. You're not thinking clearly. You need help. You can't just live like this, in some run-down apartment, all alone. The words hit me like a slap, a final reminder of the way they had always seen me, as someone who couldn't survive on her own, someone who needed them to function. But I didn't need them. I wasn't asking for help. I wasn't asking for their pity or their approval. I was living my life, and that was enough. No, Adam, I repeated, and this time my voice held the weight of a decision made, of something final. You don't get to control me anymore. I'm done being your backup plan. I'm done being invisible. And with that, I hung up the phone. The silence that followed was profound. The phone, still warm in my hand, felt heavy, like a weight I had carried for far too long. I had expected to feel relief, but instead I felt something else, something more complicated, a sense of loss, of finality, mixed with a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't over yet, not really, but it felt like a turning point, a moment where I could finally step away from the life I had been holding on to for so long. As I stood there, holding the phone, I realized something else. They had been wrong all along. I didn't need to be fixed. I didn't need to be rescued. I was already whole, already enough, and nothing they said or did could change that. I was finally free. It was late in the afternoon when the knock on the door came. I had been sitting in the small chair by the window, my fingers tracing the edges of the old wooden frame Joyce had given me. The sky was that pale shade of blue that comes right before dusk. The air cool but not cold, and everything seemed to slow down in the quiet of the evening. The sound of the knock startled me, and for a moment I sat there, not moving, wondering if it was just a figment of my imagination. But then it came again, sharp, insistent. I didn't need to check the peephole. I already knew who it was. I had been expecting this moment for days, maybe longer. It wasn't a surprise, not really. The moment I had refused Adam's request to come home, the moment I had turned off my phone and decided that I wasn't going to be part of their narrative anymore, I knew there would be a price to pay. I had left, and now they were coming to get me. But it wasn't Adam or Lisa who had come. It was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a grey suit that looked too stiff for the evening air. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished, and he had that air of someone who had been trained to get things done. He was the kind of man who knew how to make a case, how to use words as weapons. A lawyer, most likely. Someone hired to convince me that I didn't have a choice, that I was still a part of their story, whether I liked it or not. I opened the door slowly, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. I didn't feel fear, not exactly, but I felt the weight of everything that had come before. The weight of the years I had spent trying to make my family see me, trying to prove that I was more than just a mother or a grandmother, trying to carve out space for myself in a life that had never truly been mine. And now, here was this man, sent to pull me back into the life I had escaped, to remind me that no matter how far I ran, I was still tethered to them. "Mrs. Harlow?" he asked, his voice smooth, calculated, like he had rehearsed the words 1,000 times. He didn't wait for me to respond before he continued. "I'm Derek Sorensen, and I represent your son, Adam Harlow, and his wife, Lisa. They've asked me to speak with you regarding your well-being and your assets." He paused, waiting for my reaction. "They're concerned about you, Mrs. Harlow. They want to ensure you're in a safe environment." I looked at him, taking in the polished exterior, the sharp lines of his suit, the way he stood like he owned the space. But something inside me snapped. This man, this stranger, was standing on my doorstep, talking to me like I was some fragile object that needed protection, as if they had any say in my life anymore. I had made my choice. I had left, and now I was being told that I wasn't capable of making that decision on my own. It made my blood boil. "Is that so?" I asked, my voice calm, but there was an edge to it that even I hadn't expected. I didn't invite him inside. I didn't need to. I wasn't going to let him walk into my life, not after everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for. He didn't answer right away. I could see the surprise flash in his eyes. I could almost hear him recalculating, trying to figure out his next move. But I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I wasn't going to back down. "You can tell Adam and Lisa," I said, my words deliberate, each one chosen carefully, "that I don't need their help. I'm not a child, and I'm certainly not someone who needs to be managed." I let the silence stretch between us. "You can tell them that I'm fine. I'm more than fine." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable, but I didn't care. His discomfort was nothing compared to the years of discomfort I had endured. The years of feeling small, invisible, like I was nothing more than a caretaker, a housekeeper, a background character in a story that wasn't even mine. Now, here he was, trying to convince me that I needed to go back to the role I had played for so long. But I wasn't going back. Not this time. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mrs. Harlow," he said, his voice becoming more forceful, like he was trying to regain control of the conversation. "Your family is worried. They want to make sure you're okay, that you're not in any kind of danger." His eyes flicked to the window behind me, probably taking in the simplicity of my surroundings. "This isn't a suitable place for someone your age. You shouldn't be living like this." Something inside me snapped again, but this time it was different. It wasn't anger that surged through me. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize that the people who have spent your entire life telling you who you are finally starting to realize that they can't control you anymore. I took a step forward, crossing the threshold of the door, not because I wanted to invite him in, but because I wanted to make sure he understood that I wasn't afraid. "I am living like this because I want to," I said, each word firm, each one cutting through the air like a blade. "This place, this life, is mine, and I'll be damned if you or anyone else tells me what's suitable for me. I don't need anyone to tell me where I should live or how I should live. I've made my choice, and it's not your place to undo it. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to control. He was here to do what Adam and Lisa couldn't, to bend me to their will in a way they couldn't manage from a distance. But I wasn't going to let him. I wasn't going to let them. Not anymore. You don't have the right to come here, I said, my voice cold, each syllable deliberate. And I don't owe you, or them, any explanations. Tell them what you want, but it's not going to change anything. I'm not coming back. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might push harder, might try to convince me again. But then, finally, he straightened up, his expression hardening. I'll let them know you're unwilling to cooperate, Mrs. Harlow, he said, his tone no longer pretending to be polite. It was the tone of someone who had realized that they weren't going to win. But I would strongly suggest you reconsider. There are legal avenues we can pursue if necessary. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, each one a reminder that they thought they could still control me, that they thought they could still force me to be what they wanted. But I wasn't going anywhere. As I closed the door behind me, I felt something shift inside me, like a lock had finally turned. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I stopped being afraid of losing them, of being cast aside. I had already been cast aside. I had already lost them. But now, I was free. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I knew I had taken the right one. I had chosen my own life, my own future. And nothing they said or did could take that away from me. I wasn't going back. Not this time. Not for anyone. This was my life, and I was finally living it. I spent the next few weeks in a quiet daze, the kind that settles in after a storm has passed, but before the sky has fully cleared. The man who had come to my door, Derek Sorensen, a name I would forget as soon as it no longer mattered, was the last push I needed to confirm what I already knew. They weren't going to stop. They weren't going to just let me be, and the world I had left, the one where I was expected to fulfill every role but my own, was always going to be there, waiting for me to slip back into it. But I wasn't slipping. Not this time. I didn't hear from Adam or Lisa again directly after that day, but their absence was deafening in its own way. It wasn't silence, not really, but a constant hum in the back of my mind. Every time I picked up the phone, I expected it to ring with a call from Adam, or maybe even from Kieran, who had always been the only one of my children who truly saw me. I had raised him differently. I had loved him differently, with an understanding that even as a child, he needed his space, needed to learn for himself how to navigate the world. I didn't hover. I let him fall and rise on his own. That was how I had loved all my children. But Kieran had always seemed to understand what I had been giving him. He had always felt like a partner in the way I parented, in the way I lived. But I hadn't heard from him either. Still, the quiet became something I grew accustomed to, like a blanket that I could finally tuck around myself without it feeling suffocating. I spent more time in the park. I spent hours walking the streets, absorbing the small details of life that had once passed me by in the rush of taking care of everyone else. The color of the leaves changing, the way the clouds moved across the sky, the chatter of children running past me, the sound of their laughter carrying in the air like the memory of something sweet. It was during one of those walks that I saw him. Kieran. I didn't recognize him at first. He had grown. He was taller, more filled out. his hair messier in a way that was both familiar and strange. He was standing by a food truck, holding a coffee in one hand, his head tilted as if he were listening to someone. He looked out of place in a way that I knew wasn't just the city. It was the weight of what had passed between us, between me and the family I had left. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure if this was the right time to face him, unsure if I could bear the weight of his gaze. He saw me before I could turn away. He smiled, but it wasn't the carefree grin I remembered from when he was younger. There was something more complicated behind it, something older, something that told me he knew what I had been going through, knew the weight I had carried for all those years without even realizing it. "Mum?" he said, his voice quiet, but full of warmth. I didn't know what to say at first. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to come to me, to find me in a city that had felt so far from the world I had left behind. For a long moment, we just stood there, looking at each other, the years between us almost palpable. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said finally, his eyes searching mine. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me to." The words stung, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't shame or guilt, but the weight of what I hadn't said, what I had kept from him for so long. I hadn't wanted him to think he was the reason I left. I hadn't wanted him to carry that burden, but it was there, and I knew it. I had always known it. "I didn't want you to see me like this," I said, my voice rough as I finally broke the silence. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle it." He stepped forward, hesitating for a moment, before he closed the distance between us, pulling me into a hug. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a moment of redemption. But it was real, and in that moment, I realized how much I had missed the feeling of being seen, of being held, of being understood. "You're okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone." And for the first time in years, I believed him. For the first time in so long, I felt like I wasn't alone, like I didn't have to fight this fight by myself. I didn't have to be everything to everyone. I could be myself, and that was enough. We stood there for a few minutes, not saying anything more, just letting the moment settle between us. The world around us continued on. People walked past, the food truck began serving customers again, the sound of a car horn in the distance. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had made the right choice by walking away, by standing my ground, by choosing myself. Finally, Kieran pulled back, his hands still resting on my arms, his gaze still steady on mine. "Are you going back to them?" he asked, his voice soft, but I could hear the hesitation in it. The fear that maybe, just maybe, I was going to let them win, let them pull me back into a life that wasn't mine. "No," I said, my voice strong, without hesitation. "I'm not going back. Not for them. Not for anyone." He nodded slowly, and I could see the understanding in his eyes. The kind of understanding that comes from knowing that you can't always fix things, that you can't always make everything okay, but you can still choose what to do next. And in that moment, we both knew. We both understood that my decision to leave was the first step in reclaiming my life, reclaiming my space, and that the world didn't end just because I stepped away from what I had always known. "Are you staying here?" he asked, glancing around the city. I smiled, a small, quiet smile, and nodded. "I'm staying, for as long as I need to." And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. It wasn't that everything was perfect. It wasn't that everything was fixed, but I had finally made the choice that had been waiting for me all along, the choice to live my own life, on my own terms. And as I looked at Kieran, standing there with me, I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to be alone. Not anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of small moments. I started taking art classes in the mornings, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I spent afternoons at the park, sitting on the same bench I had sat on when I first started walking through the city, letting the world wash over me without feeling the need to constantly keep up with it. I called Joyce more, told her about the classes, told her about my walks, and we began to share more than just small talk. I felt something shift inside me, like the first glimmer of a life that had always been waiting for me. And now, I was finally living it. Adam called again. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence between us, between me and the world I had left, had become a comfort, a space I could finally breathe in. For the first time in my life, I was living not for anyone else, but for me. And as I walked through the streets of Portland, a city that had become my own, I knew that I had found my place.